Welcome to Esalen Live, where we chat with change agents and swim deep waters in an ongoing exploration of human potential. I'm your host, Christine Chen. Esalen remains closed to guests in line with California COVID regulations, but of course, the garden must go on. Daniel Horst is our farm and garden supervisor. He is one of the selected staff that remain on property to care for the gardens and the grounds until you come back. Food, farm, and garden is his life, and he's sharing his top 5 trends and ideas for 2021. Hi there, Daniel.
Hi, Christine. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining. Last time we were here, we're having some technical problems just trying to talk to each other. So I'm super happy to see you today. How's everything on property this morning?
Everything's well. It's a calm day out here today in Big Sur. We had some crazy wind the past couple days, but it's lovely. It's like 75 degrees right now. I'm even sweating a little bit in this long sleeve shirt, but no complaints. No complaints at
Hey,
all.
awesome. Well, we certainly thank you for staying there and taking care of the gardens and making sure everything's just right for when we come back and when the regulations are lifted. You were telling me when we were having this conversation about farm garden, gardening at home, that home gardening has just exploded during the pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so just in the past year, we've seen actually more gardening at home than probably in any time in any of our lifetimes, at least probably since the Second World War, when Victory Gardens were actually supplying about 80% of the national vegetable supply. I think a lot of that reason is, as everybody's stuck at home, there's this sort of realization of the need to do something to kind of reconnect, with the earth and with life. And especially now that everybody's working digitally, this real need to sort of unplug. So we saw a huge boom, not only in seed sales, but also in compost sales and all kinds of garden supplies and amendments. I actually had a difficult time getting seed for my own farm business last year. So we kind of see this, beautiful reawakening of sort of people in general looking to make this connection while also seeing sort of how some of the fragilities of our food system have been put on display as a result of this, pandemic. But it's been a really incredible, I've never seen so many people actually curious to know more about gardening and curious to understand how to provide for themselves and for their own, community resilience. And now's a good a time as any, really, to be on that path for sure.
And I know you're a huge champion of composting, and we'll talk specifically about a technique in composting in a minute. But I think recently you just received some compost. Can you tell us a little bit about this? These are your pictures.
Yeah, so that's the compost area here at Esalen. So we are composting anywhere in the range of right now about 300 to 500 pounds of food waste per week. When we were fully staffed and fully open, it was close to that per day that was being processed through our compost facility. So we're doing a pretty traditional hot composting practice where we're turning all of the kitchen waste and things from the garden, crop scraps, clippings from trees and grass around the property into some really beautiful, finished compost, what gardeners like to call black gold. Essentially, the process takes 2 to 3 months, and because we have such a high volume of material that we're composting, we use some mechanical assistance in the form of a bobcat. So that's been a really exciting part of my job, getting to learn to drive a bobcat and making huge amounts of fertility on site. Yeah.
Is it possible to overwhelm a compost for those of us who are home gardeners? And I'm just learning how to compost in part from you. Is it possible to do too much composting? Because I feel like I just want to throw everything in there so I don't waste anything and everything goes back to the earth.
Right.
That's not the right
That's a
thing,
good
is it?
question. So it really depends on the kind of system that you're going to use. The main thing that we need to keep in mind is keeping a balance of what we call greens and browns. So your greens will be those fresh scraps, anything that's a vegetable, anything that's green, any leaves, grass clippings, vegetable scraps. Those are all greens or high in nitrogen. And then the browns are going to be the things that are high in carbon, like straw, or woody material, wood chips, etc. So it's all about keeping that balance of greens and browns. If you have too many greens in your system, it will heat up really, really hot because of that nitrogen fuel and could potentially catch on fire. But so as long as you maintain, it's about a 25-to-1 ratio of carbon to nitrogen at the beginning, which looks like essentially equal parts that green material and that brown material. And then maintain an eye on the temperature and flip your piles, regularly once a week, about, or more so often if you can manage. You should be okay. Some things you don't really want to compost as much are meat and dairy. Those things will bog down your compost system. Also oils. So anything that's fresh vegetables or fresh plants, pretty much a good bet for your compost pile.
Well, it's interesting. I'm just thinking, all the things that you just mentioned would bog down a compost system also tend to bog down the digestive system as well. So it all kind of makes sense to me a little bit. If you're watching at home on Facebook Live, feel free to throw some questions at Daniel. He knows a lot. So get your advice from Daniel right now here from Esalen. In terms of advice, you shared with me a top 5 things that we should keep our eyes on, our ears open to in 2021. And the first one was heirloom seeds. Tell us about that, Daniel.
Yeah, certainly. So, when we look at kind of the progression and the evolution of farming and of gardening as a craft, what we've seen is kind of this return, or rather, a sort of digression away from a kind of holistic model where each of the components of the garden, we are relying upon some player in the market to provide for us. So the fertilizer salesman will be getting you your fertilizer, the compost salesman, the seed houses are, providing your seed, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of farmers and gardeners these days rely on hybrid seed varieties, which are essentially 2 heirloom varieties that have been crossed for some kind of trait, whether that's a uniform yield, sometimes a flavor or a shape. Essentially, hybrid varieties allow a commercial grower to be pretty certain of what's going to be coming out of the ground when, and basically provides a really uniform crop. So as we are looking to, increase the resilience of our own gardens and our own growing situations, one that is with these heirloom seeds, because with the heirloom seeds like this I have here is a Coeur de Bois cabbage. So this is from Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds. They only sell heirloom varieties. This is very similar to a popular hybrid now that's called Caraflex, but this variety is 150 years old, which is pretty cool to me. Um, so when you use a hybrid variety, you can actually save the seed from the plant. When you're planting when you use an heirloom variety, you can save the seed. When you're planting a hybrid variety, that seed that you can save from the plant, it won't actually grow true. It won't grow to the same, with the same characteristics as its parent plants did. So with these, heirloom varieties, we're able to start increasing our own resilience and getting back kind of in touch with natural cycles in the garden. And this variety, it comes from Italy. So when you're selecting varieties of heirlooms, it's really great to look for things that thrive in your local climate. And those, varieties that have been grown for hundreds of years will be more well adapted to where you're growing them versus, say if you pick any random hybrid and throw it in the garden, they create a really great way not only to it adds a lot of really interesting colors and textures and flavors and things that you probably will never see in the grocery store, while also, giving us a real way to kind of reconnect with these cycles and reconnect with the earth, through the practice of seed saving, which to me it's a really exciting way to just kind of, really get in touch with the mother, for sure.
That's very cool. George says that's very cool. So you're getting some thumbs up for this
Thanks, George.
advice here. Yeah. And Cindy, I think that's your mom is really happy that you're here as well. Tilla had a
Hi,
quick
Mom.
question. Tilla had a quick question about the compost before we get to your number 2 recommendation. She
Sure.
said, are dried leaves considered browns or greens? Good question.
Dried leaves would be in the brown category, yeah. So as the leaves dry on the ground, they're off gassing that nitrogen into the atmosphere. So if you harvest them when they're fresh right off the tree, they would be considered greens, but as they dry out, they would mostly just hold on to that carbon content and they would be considered browns. Leaves, fallen leaves, either fresh or dry, are a really great addition to compost of any, any tree, basically any shrub, any plant that you have. Yeah, either way, the brown or green, it'll be a good addition to the compost.
Okay, your number two recommendation for 2021, keep our eye on lasagna beds. So I just put a picture of lasagna here. It looks delicious, but that's the idea, is layers, right? So tell us some more about that.
Exactly. So, if you're expanding your garden this year or starting a new garden from scratch, especially if you have a lawn at your house, like a lot of people do, a really great way to begin working with that native soil instead of having to purchase in potting soil from, some source outside. You can actually begin to build beds in place with this method called lasagna beds. Essentially, what we're doing is layering these greens and browns and composting in place to basically build fertility where there was just grass. So how it generally starts is with a layer of either cardboard or newspaper on the sod layer on top of your grass, and then you just want to layer your greens and browns. So I have things like fresh grass clippings, an excellent green. This is coconut coir, or dehydrated coconut husks, essentially, that you can purchase and hydrate, and it's a great brown layer. You can use things like peat moss, any sort of clippings from the garden. And then you essentially want to layer them anywhere between 18 to 24 inches. You can, of course, do less if you want, but that'll build up a really nice layer of, basically compost in place. Or if you have a good source of finished compost available to you, you can just use about 4 to 6 inches of the finished compost on top of that cardboard layer. And then basically you're able to plant right into it. And over the course of a few months, as those components break down, the cardboard breaks down, you begin working with that native soil that's underneath that layer of cardboard, which is where all of the sort of indigenous microbiology lives and the things that will help your plants to, grow robustly with, that biology and that fungal life that lives, in your native ecosystem.
Zena has a question about compost since we're talking about lasagna beds and compost. She said, uh, she's always heard that animal products were a no-no in compost. Can you answer that question? And Carolyn says, very cool, by the way.
Certainly, yeah. So animal products are generally a no-no in your traditional composting pile. They won't break down the same way that plant material will. There are actually some ways that we can utilize that animal or that dairy or bones, etc., in our compost if we use a special system, which we are going to talk about here. But if you're just generally doing a standard hot compost pile that you'll build up with your layers of greens and browns and flip back and forth, you will not want to put any meat or dairy in that pile, or oil. You don't really want to put any oil. None of those will break down the same way that a plant would.
Good advice. Thank you so much, Daniel. And then your number three recommendation, as we talk about what you are liking for 2021, is syntropic agroforestry, or food regeneration. Can you talk about that and help us understand it? That's a big word.
Totally. Yeah. So this is a very specific style of food production following what a lot of people have become familiar with, this idea of permaculture, which is essentially a set of design principles that are mimicking natural ecosystem processes. So through syntropic agroforestry, essentially what we're trying to do is mimicking those systems, those successions that you would see in a natural ecosystem where a forest is sprouting from where there used to just be grassland, because that is the progression of ecosystems. Generally, forests will retake meadowlands over time. And this idea of following the successions of plantings, where first you'll see things like little shrubs and grasses, and then you'll start seeing the deciduous trees, and then you'll begin seeing the coniferous trees, through these successions. So we want to emulate that by creating what they call syntropic guilds of plants, things like ground covers like clover or perennial peanuts, with things that are, that shrub layer like berry bushes or, some kind of vining plant, and then that overstory canopy of your fruit and your nut trees. And over time, you can build those successions. You get to play around with all kinds of different plant species, see what works in your context. And essentially, the only amendment that you are adding to that system is what you call a chop and drop mulch, which is where you're just cutting parts of the plant off and throwing them on the ground, just like a forest would build its own soil. That's how we can do it, following this syntropic model.
That's so cool. If you're just joining us on Facebook Live, we're with Daniel Horst. He is the head of farm and garden at Esalen, and he's giving us his top advice for 2021. We've gone through a couple of his recommendations: Heirloom Seeds, Lasagna Beds. We just talked about Syntropic Agroforestry. And this is my personal favorite that you sent me, was Bokashi composting. A lot of compost questions today, and if you have them, please put them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. Tell us about Bokashi composting, Daniel.
Yeah, so Bokashi composting, well, it's a bit of a misnomer. People do call it composting, but actually what it is, it's essentially a fermentation process, by which we can take our food waste, things from the kitchen, and begin to ferment them using lactic acid bacteria, just like you would make something like a kimchi or maybe a lacto fermented hot sauce. We can do that with our food waste. And somebody asked earlier about using animal products in your compost. Well, this is actually one of the best ways that we can make those products available to the microbes and the decomposers in that compost pile by pre-fermenting them. So essentially all you need is a bucket, you need your food scraps, and you need some Bokashi bran, which is essentially a wheat bran or a rice bran that's been inoculated with this lactic acid bacteria. Oftentimes, it's used, commercially available product is used called EM1 or effective microorganisms, but we can actually use the indigenous biology from our area to make what we call an IMO solution, an indigenous microorganism solution. And you do this by taking essentially a cardboard box with some cooked brown rice in it and leaving it in a forested area with some nice, really, productive plants around it, some good soil, leaving it there for 3 to 7 days. And then your rice will be cultured with this indigenous microorganism bacteria and lactic acid bacteria. And then we can turn that into the IMO solution and then inoculate our rice bran or our wheat bran with it. So once your wheat bran or your rice bran is inoculated, you're sprinkling this on top of your food waste, just barely covering it, and it allows that food waste to start pre-fermenting. It's an anaerobic process, so you put the lid on, you don't let any air in, and this is a really great thing to do at home because instead of a traditional compost pile where you would have to, have a certain large volume to really start that composting process, you can continue to add for several weeks to your Bokashi bin, and it will just continue fermenting. And it doesn't smell like a traditional putrid food waste would. It smells actually kind of sweet, like a kimchi or kombucha maybe. And then you can take this finished product once it has fermented. It's what they call a biopulp. You can actually, in the lasagna process, you could use it as one of your lasagna layers if you'd like to bury it about middle of the pile. You can add it to your compost bin if you are, maintaining a compost pile, which is really great if you do have a lot of, meat or dairy or oils, or you can feed it even to your worm bins if you'd like.
Yeah.
So it's essentially a way for those microbes to pre-digest the food waste and make it more available in a more sort of bioavailable manner to those plants and to those microbes.
2 questions. First, where do we get the Bokashi? And quick. And then second, Lori Turner says, is there advice for winter composting when you have a lot of snow for months and months on end?
Sure, yeah. So you can buy Bokashi bran online from several different sources. There's one in California called SD Microbe Works that's kind of one of the main players in the game. But really, it's very simple and easy to make at home. It just takes about a week to 2 weeks, and there's plenty of guides online to show you exactly how to make the Bokashi brand, and then it'll be cheaper. And then you're using, instead of these, commercially available microbe products that just have a few different microbes that have been proven to work, you're actually using those microbes and that microbiology from your native area, which will work in your native area because it's what's already existing in that forest or in that ecosystem. So
Do we do this process at Esalen? I'm guessing that we do.
we're starting to, yeah. It's a big process for the amount of food waste that we're processing. So still looking for good sources or a way to really effectively make it on a large scale, because it can be a little particular from a temperature standpoint and different things you need to kind of keep regulated. So it's a process, but yes, we are definitely hoping to do it for all of our composting. And then as far as the composting in the wintertime, you can totally do it. I would say if you have a lot of snow, the best way would be to keep your compost in a covered area. And the heat of that microbial action will maintain through wintertime, as long as you're adding those greens and browns and maintaining a decent moisture level. You can definitely make compost when it's cold. A lot of farms actually use compost to heat their greenhouses over the winter time when there is snow on the ground. So it's totally an option. You just need to keep the snow off of it, essentially. I would say making a little lean-to structure would probably be the easiest way.
These are such great questions, and we thank our Facebook community for continuing to ask them. We're learning so much from you, Daniel, so thank you so much for being here. And one of the things you shared
Or
with me is to always have a beginner's mind when you come to this as a practice. Can you explain why this was your number 5 thing for 2021?
Totally, yeah. So there's so many ways. There's so much information out there that you can, it can be overwhelming to try to, find good resources because there's just such a high amount of information. So when you come at the garden with kind of a beginner's curiosity, you find things that you're interested in. You can find the things that you want to learn because there's so many things to learn. I know what I am interested in, what I like. It could be totally different from what's relevant for you in your context or what you're curious to know. So coming at it with curiosity and just a little bit of intuition, I think is really the best way to approach your gardening practice. But there are certainly some great resources to help speed along the process. A few of my favorites are The Market Gardener by J.M. Fortier. It's a really excellent guide for sort of whole systems design and operation of your garden from what's called the biointensive method, which is essentially using really tight plant spacings and quick rotations to really maximize your production on a small space. If you're more interested in those perennial systems that if you would like to build something like a food forest following that syntropic model, Gaia's Garden by Toby Hemingway is a really excellent home scale permaculture design book. And then there's a huge amount of podcasts available, which is one of my favorite ways to learn. Just pop in a podcast while I'm doing my weeding or sifting compost or whatever I might be doing. So I have some really farmy specific podcasts that I like to listen to, but A Way to Garden by Margaret Roach has been running for about 10 years, and she's got a ton of excellent information and a ton of experts that come on every week. So just go through the list. You'll find one that you like, I guarantee you.
All right. Any final words of inspiration for us to get our hands in the dirt and get our hands dirty, get our feet dirty in the garden, Daniel?
Yeah, I would say just do it. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. I make plenty of them, and I'm a professional. So, don't be afraid of failure, and just grow what you like. There's so much to grow. Just pick some things that you enjoy eating and just try it out.
Such great advice. Daniel Horst, it's been a pleasure. I'm glad the technology peeps up top supported us today and got us this ability to find out all that you know on this one day for this half an hour. So we'll see you again because I know you have so much more to share. Thank you. You want to give one
Certainly.
last bye, Mom? You want to say bye, Mom?
Bye, Mom, and Dad, and Carly, if you guys are watching. Love you guys.
All right.
Thanks,
we'll see you
Christine.
soon. Thank you, Daniel. It's been a
Appreciate it.
pleasure. Everyone, have
Likewise.
a great day. Stay connected, esalen.org, and also at Esalen on Facebook and Instagram. Get your hands dirty in the garden, everyone. Have a great day.